Hello and welcome to the Emotion at Work podcast, where we take a deep dive into the human condition. And I'm very excited for our episode today because it plays into some different aspects that I'm really interested in, which is how we think or feel about ourselves, and then how we want others to feel about us, and that can be manifested in the way that we look. So the way that we think and feel about ourselves then can have an impact on the way that we want other people to feel about or think about us, and that can be manifested through how we look to other people. And that's how we physically look is the focus that we're going to get into today. And some aspects of that then, so some aspects about how we look, for example, how we style our clothes or our hair or our accessories, some of those are within our control. But other aspects, so for example, maybe our height or the shape of our skeleton, the size of our feet, our hands, about things that we can't control, or at least without any kind of clinical intervention anyway. And then there are aspects that could be in our control, but at the same time might not be. And that's something else we're going to get into as we work our way through the podcast today. So my guest today trained as an image consultant around a decade ago, and their voice is one that I hugely value in the HR world on Twitter. And when I read her blog, I think it must be about 2 months or so ago, and there'll be a link to the blog in the show notes, I was inspired to ask her to come and join me on the podcast. So let's get our guest on the air. Let's get our guest on the air even. Welcome to the podcast, Denise Sanderson. Hi, Denise.
Hi there, Phil. How are you doing?
I'm really well, thank you. How are you?
Good. Yeah, I'm fine, thank you.
Good.
Really well.
That's wonderful to hear. And as per usual then, for this podcast, we'll open with an unexpected yet innocuous question. And my one for today is inspired by recent events. So, would you rather have it too hot or too cold?
That's an easy one for me. Too hot, easily. I know that you can put layers on when you're cold, but yeah, given the choice, definitely I'd rather be too warm. By the beach, ideally, but too warm than too cold.
I'd rather be too cold than too warm, I think.
Yeah, I'm definitely the person in the office that is like, shut the windows. Like I say, by the beach, nice cool breeze, but hot, that works for me.
Wow, okay. Yeah, that's got to be too cold for me.
Why is that, Phil?
Well, so I think I sweat a lot, if I'm honest. I think I'm a very sweaty man, which isn't the best way to open a podcast, I think. And those that haven't seen me for a long time will probably be grateful of the fact. But no, I don't like the stickiness, the hotness and the stickiness. I feel uncomfortable with that. So I'd rather be cooler and then put the layers on to keep myself warm. And there's probably also an element of self-consciousness from at the risk of making a blatant segue into the content today. There is a bit of kind of self-concern, I guess, or image consciousness around being the man that takes his top off with his moves out and all of that stuff as well. So
yes, we're definitely not going to go too far down that road in allowing you to go there, Phil. But we're all human, and it's part of the human condition actually to as you said in your opening, to consider the world around us and how we might appear in it. So summer is headline time, if you like, for lots of body image challenges, and a couple of things that I've written in the past and the body confidence cards that I've got do point to that. So I think the card that I've got in June very much talks about the fact that we're about to hit summer. You've been able to cover up, probably in the UK at least, for probably the last 6 months, and then suddenly you find yourself, as you say, feeling hot and sweaty, and if you're not careful, you can amplify that feeling of discomfort because you're covering up. So yeah, I mean, we could almost jump straight in with that segue.
Go on then, let's jump in. Go.
Yeah, I mean, as I say, this time of the year is a particular challenge, I think. We can cover up in the winter, you can put coats on, you can put layers on, you can put a hat on if you've got alopecia, you can kind of hide yourself in a scarf if you've got sort of a visual disfigurement. There are all sorts of things that you can do in the winter that the summer is a really exposing time, particularly if it is a nice, hot, warm summer. And we end up with all the narrative. I mean, you key in beach body now, or you go on the not that we're traveling much, but, you know, you go and you look at any posters on a bus stop or whatever, and, you know, diet culture and all of that stuff is rife, and it's particularly, you know, prominent in the warmer months. And it starts really early. So we talk about it being in the summer months, but, you know, it starts quite early, you know, get ready for. So we're putting this idea in people's heads long before the summer's even arrived, that you've got to do something about yourself to be able to enjoy and experience it. And that's wrong on so many levels, because that is not healthy. You know, it starts to challenge us mentally early. It challenges us mentally in that actual space. It has us thinking about how we look over how we feel to have the sun hit us. It then has a knock-on effect in terms of, you know, actual health. You know, if we're covering ourselves up and we're not absorbing vitamin D, then there are a number of sort of knock-on effects that, you know, it's very easy to not consider, because we think, oh, if I lose weight or if I look a particular way in the summer, I will, you know, it will change how people perceive me. So yeah, really important timing to have these sorts of conversations just before the summer, in the summer. And this year, really important, because there is evidence to suggest that COVID has amplified the way people feel about themselves. So the fact that we're going into a phase of, right, okay, everything's open again, that in itself is something that needs to be considered in this space, this image space, because, you know, research and evidence suggests that COVID has had a knock-on effect on how people are feeling about themselves, and therefore that will have an impact on how people show up back in the office. So I'm sure we'll get into that in a little bit more detail. But yeah, that's just kind of my opening thoughts. And I could very easily go off on a complete tangent, get really passionate about this stuff, because it segues into so many other conversations that we're having in society at the moment. You know, who's got a right to say what about another person? A whole range of things. But yeah, I'll stop definitely there, and I'm sure there's some questions from you that you want to get into.
Yeah, so yes, loads, and you're right. There's so in a way this conversation can go in so many different directions. So I'm really excited to see where we do go. What I was thinking was might be useful for us to begin with is to situate why we're talking about this around emotion in the workplace in particular. So because I guess if I put myself in the listener's shoes, then I'm thinking, all right, well, why are Phil and Denise talking about this then? Why are we bringing this up as a topic in an area that we think is worthy of exploration? So I'm going to start with that one, if that's okay then. So for you, with whether it be with your HR hat on or from a providing leadership within the workplace, because I know you do both, why is this topic important for you when we think about the workplace, and why do the listeners need to be aware of or pay attention to this topic, do you think, Denise?
Okay, so I'm gonna sort of jump straight in with a statistic. So there's been some work done very recently, actually, by the Women and Equalities Commission, which is a cross-party sort of group of parliamentarians. And one of the report that they've recently done on body image says that 61% of adults have body image issues that have a negative impact on sort of their lives. And the reality of it is we spend most of our time at work. So if there are 61% of the population, or at least the population that was surveyed and spoken to, are experiencing that issue, that means that a significant proportion of those people are people we work with. And so this isn't an issue that sits outside in terms of how I look on a Saturday night. This is an issue that comes to work with us every day, because we come to work every day. So our physicality comes to work every day. Now that's included on if you are sat in a Zoom call and you're thinking about, and, you know, we've seen the memes around, you know, what we started looking like when we dressed at the beginning of of this, and everybody was making sure that, you know, for a woman, hair and makeup, or anyone who wore hair and makeup was, you know, pristine. And then it kind of moves into this stage where perhaps less so, that we're less conscious about how we look on a screen now. We see more of people in their home context, for example. So we make broader judgments now. But when we are bringing ourselves to work, this whole notion of bringing your whole self to work, you know, we talk about it almost as if it's this kind of bring your mental diversity to work and bring who you are. But physically, that means you're going up to work as well. So if that's 61% of the population, or the audience at least, are having image issues, then how is that showing up at work? And for me, from an employer point of view, it shows up right through the employee life cycle. So do we make judgments when certain individuals walk through the door at the point of recruitment, for example? Does it impact around promotions, around mental health? All of these things happen at work. Again, eating disorders are on the rise. They are on the rise generally, but that issue has been amplified during COVID. So when people are going back into work, especially if they've seen the memes, if the things that they had in their wardrobe no longer fit them, all of these things play on your mind, or potentially play on your mind, when you're walking into the office in the first day, and when the conversation turns to, did you spend, you know, any of lockdown getting fit? Did you, you know, the COVID pound, I think it's being called at the moment. But how we show up to work is about how we physically show up to work as well. And actually, more fundamentally than that, if we look at our workplaces, how many people do we see around us who have visible difference, burns and scars? How many people around us do we see that are have disabilities? We know that there are going to be people at work with mental health issues. Those mental health issues include disordered eating, you know, body dysmorphia. People are coming into work, or being at work with these issues being part of them. And if we don't recognise that at work, then the knock-on effect is ultimately that we're not genuinely enabling inclusion and diversity. We're not honestly saying, bring your whole self to work and show up fully. Because, for example, somebody in a larger body, and I will use the word fat during the course of this, because that's the language that people have told me they are comfortable having used. There's a whole thing around the language. But, you know, if you are fat at work and there are memes going around, or every social event involves you eating, and you're already self-conscious, or if you have a visible difference, and then the social activity that you all do is we'll meet for a picnic in the park, and everybody, we've talked about the summer, and everybody's there in their shorts, and you don't feel comfortable doing that. How comfortable are you going to be in raising your hand in a meeting, or putting yourself out for that promotion? So I see that there is a real synergy and connection in the same way we look at all forms of diversity, in terms of how we see ourselves at work physically. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, no, it does. And one of the things that, so when we had our conversation, I think it was 3 weeks ago or so, when we 2 or 3 weeks ago, I think, when we scoped and planned this podcast, we were talking about the, you mentioned the words diversity and inclusion within the examples you were giving there. And one of the things I shared in our conversation was how I'd put together some videos recently. I'd put together some animated videos, telling some different stories about what emotion at work does and how it's come about and those things. And I was really aware of the diversity and inclusivity within that, in particular around ethnicity and race. And when I came away from our call, I think it was during our call, when you mentioned about body image and body size, I was thinking, you know what, that's something that just wasn't in my list of considerations at all. So disability was in there, but in terms of any body disfigurements, or in terms of body size or body shape, then that wasn't in my list of considerations at all. It was when you mentioned it, I was like, well, of course, and in a self-judgmental way, but at the same time, it was just outside of awareness. And is that something that you experience as well? That this area that we're talking about in particular today, in terms of body image and the physical presence that you bring, about that sitting just on the edge of awareness rather than within awareness.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm not sitting here and saying that I always get it right and that I'm an expert in this field. I'm sort of an expert in a couple of touch points and bringing them all together into this space. But yeah, definitely, it is very much about awareness. I think the flip side of that coin, though, is also about the fact that societally we marginalize. It's almost a deliberate thing that we do. It feeds the diet industry. It fuels our own egos to exclude people. So it's because it's not there. We don't see it very much. There's less representation. Now it's increasing, and there are louder voices in that space around visible difference, around sort of imagery of weight and so on. But there are, in some ways, we expect people with visible difference and fat people to kind of be kind of quiet in the room, to not show up loudly. Now, I'm not condoning or supporting that, but that is the reality. That's the experience, and why it's important to ally and to raise awareness in this space, because you've got some people, as in any form of diversity, who are willfully not going to embrace this idea of inclusion. But we also, on the other side, have, as you say, people who are not aware. And you're not going to be, because if you key in diverse images at work, for example, you don't see fat people come up in those images. You don't see visible difference in the way of scars and burns come up in those images. So it is outside of our consciousness, because it's not there in front of us. That's one aspect. But the other thing is that because we've marginalized a number of people, or a number of people with those sorts of conditions, alopecia, lookism even, we expect and we see certain people put at the forefront of things. So, some of these issues just aren't in our line of sight in reality. And I think that's one of the reasons that, for me, it's important to have that conversation. I could very much talk from the perspective of being female and Black, and there are loads of people in that space speaking on that, and I've chosen to some degree to deal with that individually and recognise lots of people are already doing it. I'll have conversations around those things, but there's lots of voices in that space. The other thing is that these issues aren't disconnected, because there is some very clear narrative around the whole ideas around lookism and weight that are attached to the things that we do see more often. So, or the people we do see more often. So women, for example, are judged differently in terms of weight. Men are judged differently in terms of height. And there are books and there is research that talks about the fact that things like fat phobia are rooted in racism. So it's a way to have the conversation is around not just these issues that I'm talking about. It's about a lot broader set of issues, but it's about bringing these issues into that space and into people's awareness and consciousness. Because the reality of it is they are very much in the consciousness of the people who are fat or who have a disfigurement and so on. So it's easy for me, as somebody who also is in, kind of a slimmer body, you start talking about privilege and people start getting a bit agitated. But the reality of it is that, yeah, we're conditioned to, if you're a fat person in a bigger body with a disfigurement, you're kind of conditioned to stay out of the mainstream. And if you are somebody that's in the mainstream, you are conditioned to keep perpetuating what you see around you and what, big business wants you to think, feel and do. And as I said, we see that all the time in advertising. We see that all the time in media, but it is changing. I'm really pleased it's changing. but it then gets considered a little bit of tokenism. Oh, are you just putting in a plus size person, or somebody with a disability, just to sort of tick the boxes? And so that's why it's more than awareness. It starts with awareness though, and then I think you have to go deeper into, no, how do we make this not about tokenism and not just about awareness, but about action? So it's not just, oh, isn't that a shame? It's, what am I going to do about it? What can I see around me? How am I going to make a difference? So that's for me why you didn't see it. And honestly, I didn't see it until I was in the sort of the image space, and I didn't even see it very early. I saw it quite a bit down the line, because people were coming to me as an image consultant and wanting to look better. And what does that mean? What that means is we're conforming to a stereotype. So it would be, black makes me look slimmer, would be one of the things I'd often hear. And it'd be, why do you want to look slimmer? You are who you are, you bring so much to the space. But I completely understand that that's not necessarily the story that society tells.
And I feel like sometimes I'm a bit of a broken record. So I talk about context a lot, and I talk about systemicness a lot. And because often, as you say, these things don't appear in isolation. I want to come back on the comment you made about I can't remember exactly the phrase you used. I think you said fat phobia is rooted in racism. So I think that I'd love to come back and explore that with you in a minute. Okay. I just want to pick up on the systemic and the contextualized stuff first. And if I think back to other episodes of the podcast that we've done, so we had Dr. Samuel Lana, who came on the podcast, I think it was episode 6 or episode 7. And within that, we talked about how we use words and language to denote in-group and out-group status, and how each organization will have its own set of phrases or terminologies or acronyms which you need to learn to fit in. So when you join that organization, there'll be a particularly unique set of words or phrases that if you don't know, that denotes you in your out-groupness. So I remember when I first started working at McDonald's, and they said, "Oh, have you cleaned the baseboards?" I was like, "What?" I said, "If you when you clean the kitchen, did you clean the baseboards?" And I was like, "No, what are the baseboards?" And they said, "Oh, well, can you go get me a stepladder? Because we need a stepladder to reach the baseboards." And I was like, "All right, okay, yeah, fair enough." So I went off and got the stepladder and came back. And they were talking about the skirting boards, but I'd never heard them referred to as baseboards before. So within, and I don't know if that was just within my store, or whether that was a thing we picked up, that came from the American lingo that then made its way over to the UK. And it was, there was lots of laughter and joviality that came afterwards. But that in-group, out-groupness, that conforming versus, I don't know what the opposite of conforming would be, being in as part of the in-group or being part of the out-group. Yeah. It seems to permeate so many different things of what we do. And in a way, there's got to be some benefits of that, as well as some challenges. So one of the I'm going to get on a soapbox now. So one of the things that I struggle with,
over it.
well, one of the things I struggle with is the bring your whole self to work thing. And when I say I struggle with it, is because as shown in the last 2 weeks in the UK. So I woke up on yesterday morning. It's Tuesday today. Woke up yesterday morning to a headline on the sports pages of my chosen news outlets, with Lewis Hamilton receives racist abuse for his following his win at the British Grand Prix. The week before that was 2 weeks ago now, was the football with Jadon Sancho, Marcus Rashford, and Bukayo Saka, and those, so clearly those beliefs, those opinions exist. So on one hand, you know what, I don't want that at work. If that's somebody's whole self, then I don't want that at work.
Yeah.
because that's wholly inappropriate. But at the same time, I want somebody to feel comfortable, to feel confident, to feel like they can put their, they can use examples you used earlier on. They can raise their hand in a meeting. They can make the application for a promotion. They can do whatever those things are. And then that brings me back full circle to the systemic and the contextual stuff, because that, without it, you're looking at something in isolation, and that limits the view that you might have of it. I don't know what my question is that brings all that together, by the way. I feel like I've just rambled for like 4 or 5 minutes, but yes, I'm going to feel like I'm going to be quiet now. Sorry.
So just picking up a little bit on what you said, I suppose how I would bring forward definitely the context bit. I think I've already sort of touched on the context. So the context at work is around somebody feeling that they can wholly contribute, if not bring them whole selves to work. Because I very much value the point that actually I don't want everybody to bring their whole selves to work, and I don't necessarily want to bring my whole self to work. I should bring the right bits to work. That's part of it. But I think I think you are right about the fact that there is a systemicness to this, and we can see that because it starts so early. It starts in childhood. So I wrote a blog called The 7 Stages of Body Image, I think it was, and using sort of Shakespeare's 7 Stages of Man. And pretty much, other than when you're a baby and you don't hear it, issues around our image start really, really early. So there was a sort of video, a viral thing going around again during lockdown, I think quite early in lockdown, around somebody showing the word in sort of air quotes, an ugly baby, and the reaction to that. Now, as a baby, you don't get that, but as a parent, you're already being conditioned to show your child in a way that is acceptable to sort of society. So it starts very early, and parents are conditioned in this way. And then you think about that the evidence suggests that children sort of between the ages of 3 and 5 are already having body image issues. And that's because society surrounds them with these images. So I work with an organisation called the Body Happy Kids organisation. Molly Forbes is an absolute sort of genius in this space. There's lots been done on children. The reality of it is even the Disney characters that we see all have a particular look. The bad characters in children's stories are either bald, scarred, or fat. So very early on, we're making an association with the way we look and what it says about us as a person. So you're out in the street and you look up at a billboard, and you see that the way to be healthy and to be loved and to be valued in society is to be slim, white, able-bodied, and so on. Now, it might be that that's not what society is telling you, but they're certainly not showing you much in the way of an alternative. And there are some sectors, the beauty industry, the diet industry, the fitness industry, that literally do thrive on creating that environment. Now, that's not all of them. Diet industry is slightly different, but that's not all of them. So, the health at every size movement, you have people like Tally Rye who and Dr. Lindo Bacon, I think, talk about health at every size and trying to break down and dispel some of the medical myths. Don't get me started on BMI, we'll be here a while, but around some of the medical myths around health is slimness. Now, when you throw into the mix that eating disorders are a real issue and mental health is a real societal issue, if we aren't careful at joining up the dots, society is actually creating the problem that the diet industry and others are saying that they're trying to solve. So we do have a society-wide issue, and that's taking it outside of the work context a little bit. But again, to bring that work context in, all of those narratives play out in the workplace. All of those narratives play out in the workplace. and particularly if you have, we all know what our demographics are in our organisations around sort of race and gender and sexual orientation and so on. It's that point you made before about awareness. Are we even aware of the impact of some of our behaviours and our activities on people who don't fit the mould and aren't covered to some degree by the protected characteristics? Because some of the issues I'm talking about are covered by protected characteristics and under the Health and Safety at Work Act. So it's definitely something that is systemic and societal, and there is some evidence to suggest. I think the people management, or one of our HR magazines in 2005, I think, did a study of HR professionals, and I'm actually looking the data up now. And of 2,000 professionals, a whopping 93% of people questioned would choose a normal weight applicant over someone in a higher weight body. So that's stuff that's coming out from our profession. And I can obviously links to the article.
Please.
And,
Definitely.
I think it was 2015, I think, Mental Health Awareness Week. In fact, I've got 2019, Mental Health Awareness Week focused on body image. And again, we had lawyers talking about lookism, and, we've had HR professionals talking about, is lookism, is fat phobia, are these the last sort of bastions of where you can be kind of bullish and be unprotected? I mean, there are other things, do redheads get impacted? And, I'm not comparing these things to sort of the racism that you've talked about. And I'd like to point out that, that racism appeared when you win and when you lose.
Exactly.
So, 2 weeks ago, people were saying, oh, it's because they'd failed. And, as you say, recently we're seeing that's not the case. So I'm not suggesting that these things are directly compared, but actually, if you listen to the narratives around race, there are similarities in the narrative, particularly around weight. So, for example, we make associations, and this will link in with your kind of what's the thing about ethnicity, Denise. The whole tropes and stereotypes around laziness are, well, if they're fat and they're in a bigger body, they can't be fit and they must be lazy. Well, actually, that's not that dissimilar from some of the narrative that you hear around race, that, certain groups of society, and certain groups in society are lazy. They don't work as hard. You might look at travellers get pulled into that sort of scenario as well. So, yeah, these things are interconnected, and as I said, for me, it's why it's not a safe space to talk about weight and visible difference, because you get mocked just as much. You get the whole, well, people can lose weight, it's not the same as race, but again, it's not as simple as that. There's a lot that goes into the sort of health of a person. But yeah, definitely around our work, there are clear links. There are clear links to society and how that then ends up back at work. And now I'm the one that's rambling a little bit. And
no, so one of the things that you got me thinking about, and the risk is, now I say this and it implies that I wasn't paying attention to what you were saying, and I was, I promise. As you were working your way through that, I was thinking about how many disabled bosses have I had. And I was thinking about how many fat bosses have I had? How many bosses have I had with some kind of visible difference? And I'm struggling to. And granted, it's a sample size of one, and there's the selective memory aspects of it as well. But when I think about those things that you said are just on the edge, and are they the last bastions of unprotected characteristics? And I then think about my workplace experiences, and I'd encourage the listeners to do the same. Think about your organization, think about the team that you're in, or where you've worked in the past, and how many of those in senior positions within those organizations have been some of the things that Denise and I are talking about today. Because my lived experience would be, there isn't that many. On one hand, so bearing in mind I've worked in one, two, three, four, five different organizations, and within that, some have employed anything from 10,000 up to 100,000 people. And again, I'm risking making it sound as though I know there's issues with what I'm saying in terms of representation and or experience and memory. So with all that said, though, I'm struggling to come up with a case that those people are represented in those work experiences that I've had. Sorry.
No, it's got me thinking, actually. And I would say I've been quite fortunate in as that I have got people in my past that I can point to. But sometimes those roles were, or those circumstances were sort of conditioned, or they were tempered with something else. So I think it's a really great question to say, who are we looking at and who do we see around us? And if in an organisation, it's a bit like, again, the link to races, if you're in an organisation and you set an objective to increase your numbers, say, in an ideal world, you said, right, okay, this is now an issue we recognise. We're going to bring people in with this sort of, who are on the margins of these sorts of issues. Do you know people? Who do you reach out to? How do you connect? How do you ally and support? So I've been fortunate in as that I worked with somebody years ago who on a reception desk had a facial scar. However, he was male, he was tall, and he was considered attractive, despite, again, like you, I'm trying to manage my language here, but I hope the listeners know that I'm supportive of this. So if something comes out and it's not quite right, I'll correct it. But, so ticked a lot of other boxes. I've worked with a fat female boss. She's actually a friend of mine now. But again, just a really bubbly character, really exceptional at what she did. There are still, though, people who, as you say, the majority, if I look through my career, I think those two immediately come to mind. But I've had a near 30-year career, and you're right, I can't think actually off the top of my head of more than those two individuals. And I don't know necessarily their full story about their rise into those roles. But we do know, if you look it up and you go, short men at work, you see the research that says that, taller men are more likely to get promoted. You see the research that says women who are deemed traditionally more attractive or who wear makeup are more likely to get a role. Like I said, our own sector, those 2,000 HR professionals are saying, yeah, I'd be more inclined to recruit someone in a smaller body. So yeah, it's definitely about representation, and it's about, we will keep coming back to this idea of awareness. I'm not suddenly suggesting that organisations go into sort of panic mode, but it's a bit like your example and your experience, that when we were having the conversation, you went, yeah, I didn't have anyone in my kind of cartoon or video. And to be fair, the image I use on body image at work doesn't have any plus size fat people or scarred people in it either. That's because, and again, this is the systemic nature of it, I use free image sites. There are sites that work specifically in diversity, but those images cost. And when you look at fat people at work, what you get is pretty horrible images, actually. I'm not even going to kind of detail what they're like. They're not pleasant images. So it's quite cyclical. There's quite a cycle here that is, somebody may not put themselves into the workspace or might not put themselves up for a promotion, and therefore you don't see fat or visibly disfigured people so much in roles. Therefore people aren't going to apply for roles because they don't see themselves represented, and we go back round in the cycle again. But yeah, it's a good challenge to people to just check your own bias. It is as simple as that. And I still get it wrong in conversation. So I had a conversation last week and somebody sort of said, well, doesn't this apply to sort of people in smaller bodies, because I get commented on as well? And that's absolutely true. And that's a very valid point. And I acknowledge that. And we had a conversation about that. And then I was kicking myself afterwards because I didn't go full circle back round and say, yes, but you are still not disadvantaged, marginalised, and frankly bullied in society, at least to the same extent. So if you think about sort of John Amici's descriptor of white privilege, it's not that you are not disadvantaged in any way because you are attractive, because we hear that argument, or in a smaller body, we hear that argument, but it's because those things are not holding you back in terms of your career, in terms of your ability to travel, in terms of your ability to go shopping, in terms of your ability to not have memes about you on on social media. So the first blog I wrote in this space during lockdown was say no to mean memes, because just like literally my whole Facebook page was covered in jokes that were fat phobic. It was just like, okay, would we do this in any other context? So definitely there's something about us raising our own awareness, us being perhaps more challenging at work. If somebody who doesn't fit societal's traditional norms comes into a room, black women and hair, a fat person, somebody with a visible difference, when we sit in that recruitment meeting, they've probably put themselves through quite a lot to come into that position in the first place. That's obviously not everybody in those categories. But are we then making a decision about recruiting someone and attaching it to something, but not checking our own biases in that space? So, I'll stop there because again,
no. So I enjoy listening. I'm enjoying listening. So no, it's good. It's good. So I was going to come into a question about what should we do then? So what advice can we give to the fair listener to help them be more inclusive? Literally, as I said that question in my head, I'm now going, oh, fair listener. Is there something wrapped up in that? But that's something I'll come back to for another. I'll reflect on to think about for future episodes. So so when we think about the listener, then what advice can we give for them to be more inclusive and to I guess within that last piece you talked about the bringing it into awareness, the considering our own biases, and thinking about if individuals with those characteristics that you mentioned arrive for an interview or arrive on a Zoom call, how are we checking our own biases within that? What else would we suggest then to the listener to say, here are some things to think about?
I would, as in, with any area that your interest might be triggered, is do the research. There's some really good stuff out there. So, as I've mentioned, sort of Body Happy Kids or Body Happy Org, actually, there's some really good stuff in there for adults. There's a book by Sabrina Strings on racism and fat phobia, called Fearing the Black Body. Social media, expand your network however you might choose to do that. So look for hashtag HAES, Health at Every Size. So I think there's something about obviously doing your own research. There is the point about representation that I've made. So can you I'm an individual looking for images, but if you're an organization that's paying for images, can you make sure your images are diverse? Do you give voices to everyone in your organization? If you've got somebody who's quiet in your organization and perhaps it's connected to one of these things, do you encourage them and amplify their voice? I think for HR professionals as well, it's about looking at how this fits in with what already exists, so it doesn't become another thing that, say, HR are owning as being, oh, here's another sort of hobby horse that they're on. I've talked about eating disorders, I've talked about mental health, I've talked about the narrative of return into the office, not returning to work, returning to the office. So think about those things and how this might be connected. If you're doing training on D, E, and I, don't exclude this from the conversation, because as we've talked about, there are groups that are marginalised that don't strictly fall into the protected characteristics. Ask people. So, if you have people in your organisation who you think maybe are marginalised, talk to them. Know where to signpost people as well. So again, just a couple of references. So there's an organisation called Changing Faces, which is offers support for anybody with any kind of visible difference. BEAT is an eating disorder association, and so do those things. What I would say is all of those things are relatively passive, however. And so my big challenge to people is, in the way that we are encouraged to do it for any other form of any other marginalised group, call out the bad behaviour. Call it out. Be prepared to challenge the stereotype and challenge people. Now, you can really only do that from a solid base of having done your own research in the first place. And just be prepared to just present counter arguments. So, health and weight is one of the really big ones that's really hard to kind of to separate. And I'm not claiming to be an expert, and there are experts on both sides of this argument, and they are in disagreement. But it's about being prepared to challenge the narrative. It's being prepared to say, I don't find that meme funny. It's being prepared at your social events to, in the same way that we have soft drinks as well as alcoholic drinks, allowing for the fact that somebody may have a drink problem, for example. We need to make sure that there are choices that people have. We need to think about the social activities that we do as a workplace and how that might be impacting on somebody. So if you always go out to eat, for example, what impact might that have? Now, I don't have all of the answers, in part because I am slim privilege, right? But the point is being prepared to ask the questions, being prepared to learn and grow, and recognise that we're continuing to learn and we're continuing to grow, and that this isn't separate to all of those other things. This isn't as such me saying add something new. This is about me saying acknowledge that this is not new and this is already part of some of these other things that we are working on as a HR profession and dealing with. If you're a DEI specialist, a HR professional, if you are a line manager, just be mindful of anything that's triggered or, made you reflect that you've heard me talk about today.
Wonderful. Thank you, Denise. I think I'm going to put us together and wrap us up then. So we talked about there's been a whole host of kind of examples of studies and research and books that you've mentioned as we worked our way through. So what I'll do is, if you can send me the links to the things that we've mentioned and we've discussed. So if you've got a list of either the research papers or the books or the articles or the whatever that might be of things that we've discussed as we worked our way through, if you send those across, I'll put those into the show notes. And then when I write the show notes, if there's any that I'm missing, I'll drop you a line and say, have you got anything on this or have you got anything on that?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So I can make sure that we put all of those in, if that sounds okay. If this is something that somebody wanted to explore with you some more, what would be a good way for people to get hold of you?
So I have a Instagram account called the Body Confidence Cards. I have a number actually of Twitter accounts. So there's a backstory to why I've got more than one Twitter account on this. But if you look at the let me look them up actually, Phil, to make sure I'm giving you the right things. Hold on.
Well, you can send them over if you want, and I can put them in the show notes for people to find as well. So.
How about I do that, because there are a couple of things. I'll do a link to a sort of product that I've got, I'll send over the links to you, because there are a few ways that people can obviously get in touch with me. And what I would say as well is this is something that I'd like to be doing more of, taking it forward. I'd like to run some maybe workshops or seminars or or webinars or what have you in this space with case studies and a lot of what we've covered. And I definitely think there's some mileage in working with coaches and working with DE&I specialists in this space. So that's kind of the next thing that I'm thinking, but I'll send you some stuff that kind of links those thoughts, if you like.
Yeah, sounds really good. And what we'll do as well, I'll make sure that the Emotion at Work podcast Instagram account there's a share of your profile of the cards profile on there as well, and also it might be if you're looking for a community to maybe test some of these things with and play with, at the risk of a shameless plug. The Emotion at Work community has relaunched recently, and we've moved over to a community platform that's just got discussion and the interaction really at the heart of it, which is fantastic. And also we've got an area where we're putting together some resources. So if you have one of the things that we can do is talk about whether there might be some resources that we can make available to the members, so that so there can be some things in there that might help them as well, if that would be okay.
Yeah, no, that would be fantastic.
Wonderful.
I hope I didn't ramble too much. There were definitely points where I was like, I think I've lost the thread.
No, not at all, Denise. It's been a wonderful podcast. I mean, one of the things that well, you know me already. I really like to listen to what people have got to say. So and if it wasn't interesting, I promise I'd have interrupted and told you. So no, it's
good to know.
It's been really good. It's been really good. So before I wrap us up formally, then, and we close off the podcast, is there anything else, or is there something else that you're thinking, feeling, or want to say?
I think I've probably said it all, other than to say, I hope people will engage with me to continue the dialogue, and to help me grow. People share their experiences with me. That would be really helpful as I kind of continue this journey. But for the listeners, I suppose that the final message really is that we shouldn't be beating ourselves up about the fact that we maybe this hasn't landed with us previously, because it's almost the systemic nature of what we've been talking about means that it's not on our radar because it supports some sectors of society. And our role is not necessarily to change the world, it's to change where we are, to do what we can to ally with people who might be marginalised, actively ally, not just say, I hear you and isn't it sad, to be prepared to actually do something to make a difference. And so in a way, it's a reflection back to the readers. I always say to people, what one thing will you do? It's great if you found it interesting, but what one thing are you now going to go and do? So I suppose the last thing that I would say is just share that stuff, be prepared to do something and share and help build a community of allies if you are not in that marginalised group, and know that there are people out there. There are a whole wealth of people out there who are in this space, less so at work. So let's make this a conversation that we start having as a HR profession, as DEI professionals, so that it doesn't become another big thing, but it doesn't go back to being something that we're just not considering anymore. So it's a plea rather than an offer. And I'm here to support that in any way that I can.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your time today. I've really, really loved having you on. And it's been a fascinating conversation, and I've really, really enjoyed it. So thank you, Denise, so much for your time, and thank you for coming on the Emotion at Work podcast.
Thank you for having me. Thanks so much, Phil. Take care.
Thanks. You've been listening to the Emotion at Work podcast, and if you got this far, you must be interested in the role that emotions have in the workplace, either within individuals, between people in teams, or in organisations as a whole. So head over to the Emotion at Work hub, which you can find at community.emotionatwork.co.uk. Thanks for listening.